Alright, in our last section, we're going to talk about our last group of macromolecules, which are the nucleic acids. So, nucleic acids include DNA and RNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and ribonucleic acid. So it actually has nucleic acid right there in the name here. So the Na is nucleic acid, nucleic acid. We'll talk in a second about what makes the D and the R. Both of them, their building blocks are called nucleotides. So nucleic acids are the main category, and then the nucleotides are going to be the monomers or the building blocks that are put together to make them. So there's three parts to a nucleotide: a sugar, and that's actually where the D and the R come from. In DNA, the sugar is a sugar called deoxyribose, and in RNA, the sugar is called ribose. And so deoxyribonucleic acid has the sugar deoxyribose, ribonucleic acid has the sugar ribose. The second part of every nucleotide, every building block, is something called a phosphate group. I should have a picture of this coming up. And then the last part is something called a nitrogen base. Now their shapes are slightly different. DNA is a double helix, so it looks something like this. You've probably seen that before. RNA is not. It's a single chain. It actually is not a double helix in shape. And they both have to do with making proteins. So DNA is the molecule of inheritance. It's sort of like, I like to compare it to the blueprints, which they actually have that word here as well. It's the blueprints or the directions for what proteins your body's going to make. And it turns out that the DNA, the directions, gets read by the RNA, which is sort of like the workers, and then the workers build all the proteins of your body. Now, we already talked about proteins: enzymes, hormones, the pigments in your skin, hemoglobin that carries oxygen in your blood. All of those proteins are coded for by your DNA and built by your RNA. So this is a picture of a nucleotide. So this is the sugar. It's a 5-carbon sugar here. The carbons, they actually don't write the letter C for carbon. It's a sort of a shortcut they use in chemistry. So this is the 5-carbon sugar. It's actually shaped kind of like a pentagon. This is the phosphate group. That's not hard to remember because it's got a P in the middle for phosphorus. So phosphate, phosphorus. And then this is called a nitrogen base. And you see here how it's actually like these ring structures, and it actually has nitrogens in it. So that's kind of makes it easier to identify the nitrogenous base. This one happens to be a base called adenine. So this is sort of what one side of a nucleotide of a DNA might look like. They've really made it kind of abstract here. So this is the nitrogen base here. There's actually 4 of them in DNA, A, T, G, and C, and we're actually going to talk about that much later in the year. And then they're showing the sugar and the phosphate over here on the side as a backbone. This is a more a bigger picture showing how this would twist into that double helix shape, and the nitrogen bases would connect in the middle. By, if you remember the dots, they mean hydrogen bonds. So to summarize everything, so let's go back to our carbohydrates. So what do they consist of? Well, our carbohydrates consist of our building blocks, monosaccharides. Those were our simple sugars. Put them together, we got disaccharides and polysaccharides. And some examples were sugars and starches. And we oftentimes associate them with our source of energy. Although, remember that plant cell walls were also made by a carbohydrate, and that's technically not an energy source. Lipids consisted of fatty acids. That was their building blocks, which were non-polar, and that's why they don't dissolve well in water. And they included fats, oils, and steroids, which can, cholesterol is an example of a steroid, and then you have a few hormones that are steroids, like estrogen and testosterone. We also talked here, you should know, that the difference between fats and oils, how fats are saturated, they're solids, and then oils are liquids. And one of the main things that we do with our lipids is we store energy, although steroids, again, are hormones. Nucleic acids, which we just talked about today, Their building blocks were called nucleotides, and our examples were DNA and RNA. Remember, DNA is sort of like our blueprints. They kind of said that both the DNA and the RNA were blueprints, but really the DNA is the blueprints, and I would say that RNA is the workers, and their whole job is to be the directions for making proteins, which is our last group. They were made of amino acids, and they included structural proteins, hormones, and enzymes, and we spent a little extra time talking about enzymes. So the DNA would be the code, and the RNA would be the workers for building all of these proteins. And so that concludes our chapter on macromolecules, the chemistry of life.